Hello, robust Scrum product owners. Welcome to Backlog Refinement. You'll be spending a bunch of your time refining your backlog. It's one of the key leverage points you have to maximize the value being produced by the team. Let's start by looking at what the Scrum Guide says the refinement conversation is about. This is at scrumguides.org. It's the act of adding detail, estimates, and order to items in the product backlog. So this video is divided into those three sections. This is an ongoing process in which the product owner, that's you, and the development team collaborate on the backlog items. And then during backlog refinement, which is often a meeting, but it doesn't have to be, backlog items, such as user stories, are reviewed by everyone, the product owner and the development team, and they're revised. Sometimes details are added and subtracted. Sometimes estimates are given. Sometimes the order is changed. The Scrum team, that's everyone, product owner, development team, Scrum Master, decides how this is done and when it is done. Often it is a meeting, but it can be a series of conversations. One cool thing to do for advanced teams is to do it just in time. Right before you're going to pull in a user story, you do refinement. That's an advanced practice. One tip is that the development team spends no more than 10% of their time doing this work. Notice that in a 40-hour work week, that's several hours of work. So set that expectation. And notice that the backlog items can be updated at any time by you, and I often see that happening. The product owner discovers something during a sprint, discovers something while discussing something with the product owner or the customer, and they change the estimates, they change the detail, they change the order of the items in the backlog, okay? So it's typically the case that backlog items are more refined near the top of the backlog. The things that are about to happen, that are about to go into a sprint, are super detailed, okay? They're estimated, they're ordered. And then lower in the backlog, you have less details. For example, there may be some stories that are still epics that don't fit into a sprint, okay? And it's critical, right, that any items that the team takes into a sprint, right, can be finished by the team, right? They meet the definition of done, right? And typically there's also a definition of ready, which we'll discuss, which indicates when a product backlog item can be taken into a sprint. Finally, note that the development team is responsible for all estimates. The product owner is not allowed to push the team to create smaller estimates to get more stuff done. The product owner should respect how long the development team is going to take and what their estimates are. And the product owner can, of course, help reduce the user story to split the story so that it's smaller, but the product owner should not say, hey guys, I'm pretty sure that this is a lot smaller than you think it is. So that's the overall perspective. So refinement is about detail, estimates, and order, and that's how we're going to break down this section. So when it comes to detail, I'll point out that it's all about collaboration, and then we'll talk about 5 specific areas. The definition of ready, which describes what it takes for a PBI, a product backlog item, to be taken into a sprint. We'll say a few more words about acceptance criteria. Then I'll talk about whether or not design and business logic need to be ready before the sprint starts. And then I'll talk about fitness tests, which are a particularly cool way for the product owner to describe the behavior of a system. Second, I'll talk about estimates. Here, the top level comment is, don't bother estimating when it doesn't matter. There are many teams that do not estimate user stories. They just make sure that they're small enough. Story points are probably the most common way to estimate on a Scrum team. That's a way to do it. The way I recommend is to use empirical data to create estimates. So in fact, that doesn't take any time almost whatsoever. You're just using the historical data of how long it took a story to complete. And then we'll conclude by talking about how to order the backlog. First, respecting the fact that even though we're trying to follow INVEST, and the I in INVEST stands for independent, sometimes there are dependencies. So we need to respect that while creating order. I'll talk about business value, which is probably the most common way, but it has a lot of challenges. Moscow is sort of a fun way to order the backlog. It stands for must have, should have, could have, won't have. And then finally, cost of delay, which is the technique that I recommend. Okay, so let's talk about detail. The most important thing here is that it's all about collaboration between the product owner and the development team. How much detail is necessary? There is no way to know that up front. That's something that you'll discover in a conversation with the development team. And sometimes you will have development teams that need a sentence or two, and sometimes they will need much more. And over time, you as the product owner will discover how much detail is necessary. The goal here is to create software. The detail that's best is the detail that leads to the creation of the most software. And as always, try face-to-face communication instead of written documentation. The definition of ready is a great tool that you may want to implement. It's totally optional. It's the counterpart to the definition of done. The definition of done indicates when a PBI is done. The definition of ready indicates when a PBI is ready to be taken into a sprint. So here's an example definition of ready. The story has been estimated. The story is small enough to fit into a sprint. The story has acceptance criteria. The user interface design is complete. So the definition of ready is something that you, as the product owner, would discuss with the development team. And you'd ask, what do you guys need for a PBI to be ready, for you to start developing against it? Make sure that you don't turn this into an argument or into a contract, where you're arguing that a story is ready and the development team isn't. The goal of this is to be transparent and to be clear. It's to help collaboration, make sure it isn't hindering collaboration. Acceptance criteria. How much detail is required in the acceptance criteria? Compare these two options. The checkout system will accept all forms of payment. The checkout system will accept Amex and Visa. Sometimes the first one will be best and most appropriate. Sometimes the second will be most appropriate. What format will you use? In a previous module, we discussed the Gherkin given when then format. Do you want to collaborate with your development team on deciding on an acceptance criteria format that you'll follow on every user story or every PBI? Design, user interface design. This is often something that trips people up. So you need to decide with your development team whether or not the user interface design needs to be ready at the start of the sprint. And there is no right answer. The question here is what works for your team. Some organizations have separate design teams that are different from the product development teams, and they work independently and they create design which is then input into product development. In other organizations, the product owner and the development team do the user interface design, in which case it might be appropriate for all of the user interface design to take place within a sprint, in which case it's a series of tasks on a user story or a PBI. And a third option is that the product owner does a high-level sketch and the details are worked out during the sprint. What's the right level of detail for your team? This is a completely pragmatic question. Something similar is true for business logic. How much do you need to specify? Compare these two options. the software will accept social security numbers which are valid, or option number 2, the system will accept social security numbers which have 9 digits, which can be verified using a national registry, etc. How much detail do you need to provide when it comes to business logic? How much of this is a conversation? How much needs to be written? Even the fundamental question of who is responsible for business logic could come up here. Sometimes business logic is very difficult to separate from the technical details and the technical architecture. So you need to be clear about what is business logic and what isn't. So those are a few ideas that you can use to understand detail. One of my favorite approaches is to use fitness tests. So fitness tests are black box tests that simply specify the input and the output. They're useful for all sorts of things, but they're particularly useful in situations where you have certain types of calculations. For example, let's say that you have a multiplication calculation. You're building a calculator. So you as the product owner would specify inputs like 2 and 5 and specify the output. And this table would become part of your acceptance criteria. So these are tests that the software would need to pass. So this is an example of a way to communicate detail to the development team that I found to be particularly powerful. Let's turn now to estimates. The top level comment I want to make is that you shouldn't worry about estimates when they're not providing value. I see lots of Scrum teams spending an enormous amount of time estimating PBIs and user stories. My suggestion is to time box all estimates and simply pick a number and proceed. Don't let your team get stuck on estimation. Right? That's something that's left over from the waterfall world, where the development team is required to provide good estimates, and if they fail to do so, they get punished. An estimate here is just a way to communicate and coordinate the efforts of the team. Okay? Know that some of the highest performing Scrum teams do not estimate user stories at all. They just make sure they are small enough to fit into a sprint, and then they count. So if they've done 30 stories in the last 5 sprints, then they do 30 stories for the next sprint. And if they are moving faster, they just add more sprints after they're done with their 30. And finally, don't confuse accuracy and precision. For small items that are going to be done immediately, you may need to know what sprint they're going to be done in. But for epics that won't be done for a year, you probably don't need that level of precision. So story points are the most familiar way to estimate. You're almost certainly already doing this or have heard about this. Story points are quantized exponential effort. They're typically expressed in a Fibonacci sequence, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. So here, 3 ones take the same amount of effort as 1 3. Okay? So you're doing a relative estimation. And the standard format is to give each member of the development team cards. So in the example that I give above of 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, each team member would have 6 cards. And then the product owner presents a user story, and each member of the development team selects a card. So let's say that everyone selects 3, and one team member selects 2, and one team member selects 5. So those are the high and low estimates, the 2 and the 5. And so those 2 people would have a conversation. They would explain their estimate. And then this would be repeated until everyone agrees. Again, don't overdo this. I suggest time boxing this and then simply picking a number. You'd have a decision rule. I often say just pick something that's approximately in between, like an 8 or a 5. And if it takes more than 15 minutes to estimate a story, you just pick that number. And then you take that into the retrospective and you learn from it. So don't let your team get stuck on estimation. If you're a distributed team, try planningpoker.com, which is a neat online tool. Now, story point estimation has very significant disadvantages. In fact, Ron Jeffries, who might have invented story points, says that he might not want to do this anymore, right? He apologizes for it. There are many problems with story points. They can be easily gamed. They don't take into account wait time between teams. Okay? So be cautious about how to use story points. Here's what I recommend instead. I recommend instead that you use empirical estimation. So you just look at the actual performance of the team and you record how much time it takes to complete a story. That's all you do. You look at the start time and the finish time, and then you use a Monte Carlo tool to estimate the completion date. And if you want to have more information about how to do this exactly, I encourage you to set up the 30-minute one-on-one meeting with me. If you want to do this on your own, I strongly recommend the Troy McGinnis site, focusedobjective.com, where he has a free Monte Carlo tool. Here's what it looks like. What you do is that it produces an estimated forecast, a simulated forecast. So it will tell you that in 81 cases, you're finished here on May 20th. In 103 cases, you'll finish on May 27th, and so on and so forth. And this is based on the historical performance of the team. All you need to do is input when each PBI or when each user story started, the date it started, and when it finished. And it will automatically simulate when you're finished your backlog. And down below, you see a set of simulated burn downs, right? This is your path of progress, right? And so this doesn't require any estimation whatsoever. It doesn't require the development team to guess user stories. All you do is use their historical performance. And typically, you just need a couple of dozen user stories to be completed to start creating these simulations and using empirical estimation. So this is a great way to do release planning. And we'll go into it in more detail in the release planning module. Let's talk now about dependencies. Okay, the goal is to have independent user stories. That's the I in invest. But that does not always happen. So you as the product owner should respect technical and product dependencies. And so you need to decide as a product owner how you're going to visualize dependencies so that you don't order the backlog in a way that doesn't respect them. The most common way of implementing ordering is to use business value. You can use a qualitative assessment like high value, medium value, low value. You can do an ROI calculation. You can calculate how much money you're going to make and what the cost is and divide the two. You can do a net present value calculation. So net present value discounts future value. So $100 today is worth more than $100 a year from now. Just know here that quantifying business value is inaccurate and imprecise. And so that's why we spent an entire module on determining value. And my recommendation there was to create little experiments in which you actually go into the market as quickly as possible to figure out the value of the work that you're doing. So business value is like story point estimation. You have to be very careful about using it. You could spend a massive amount of time calculating your business value, creating complicated financial models, and discover that they're way off. And so I've got a link in the resources section of this video, which gives you additional ways to order your product backlog, but we'll take a look at a couple of them right now. One of them is called Moscow. It's a very simple approach. What user stories must you have, should have, could have, and won't have? The won't have here is the most important. It specifically indicates what you're not going to be doing. So this is a fun thing to do as a group exercise. Take all of your user stories, put them on sticky notes, and then put up 4 big posters, one that says must have, one says should have, one says could have, and one that says won't have, and then organize the stickies into those categories. The way that I recommend is to use cost of delay. So cost of delay was introduced into the Agile community by Don Reinertson and David Anderson. And here's the fundamental question. If you were to delay a user story by a month, Will that cost you $1 million or $1,000? And David Anderson created sort of 4 qualitative shapes to describe the cost of delay. So every user story can be categorized into one of these 4 types. You have expedite. So expedite is something like a production bug. So for every minute in time, the impact increases, right? Every time I have this production bug, every second that it's still there, it's costing me $1 million a day. The second type is fixed date. So this is something like regulation. The government has said that by this date, I need to have something in place. So if I get it done before then, there isn't a lot of value in that. But if I get it done after then the government is going to charge me a penalty. Standard is what most user stories are, right? There's some value which then flattens out, right? So initially it's considered to be a benefit to the customer, and then after that, the value just disappears, right? And then finally, there's intangible. Intangible is something like technical debt. So technical debt, removing it has a little bit of value, and then at some point in time in the far future, it prevents the system from functioning, in which case the cost goes way up. And so qualitatively, you can categorize all of your user stories into these 4 groups. And then specifically, you can ask this question that Don asks, which is a delay worth $1 million or $1,000? And what's amazing is that when you talk with your stakeholders, you talk with your customers about this, there will often be factor of 10 differences in what they say. So some people will say that a delay of a week will cost $1 million, and other people will say the delay of a week will cost $100,000. So it's a great tool to use to prioritize and to order your backlog. So that's backlog refinement. Remember, it's something that's done collaboratively with the development team, and it's something that can be done either in a meeting or in a series of conversations. I know you're going to enjoy doing this. Let's move on to the next video.